You are not born into greatness, you are born into debt, dirt, and a future so predictable it feels like a punishment. Rome does not ask if you can afford to live. It simply assumes you will figure it out or disappear quietly. Hunger teaches faster than school, and unlike school, it actually prepares you for what is coming. Then Rome offers you a solution. Not freedom, not opportunity, just a different kind of problem with better branding. They call it service, honor, citizenship, words that sound expensive but cost you everything. You sell your life for regular meals and the vague promise that you might matter someday. There is no heroic farewell, just the understanding that you are now replaceable on a larger scale. Welcome to the Roman army, where individuality goes to die before you do. This is not chaos, this is structure, and structure is much better at killing people. You are no longer a person, you are a unit that breathes. Training is simple. Repeat until your body stops complaining or stops working. Pain is not punishment here, it is feedback. You learn that your life depends less on skill and more on the man standing next to you. Roman combat is not beautiful, it is efficient, which is worse. Half your job is not fighting. It is building the place you might die in. Nobody talks about glory when they are too tired to hold a spoon properly. Discipline is not optional. It is enforced with creativity and enthusiasm. Eventually, you stop thinking in I and start thinking in we, which is exactly the point. The armor does not make you stronger. It just makes you harder to remove. By now, you are no longer training to survive. You are training to function. Your first battle arrives quietly, like something that has been waiting for you. Fear is normal, but Rome prefers if you keep it to yourself. You do not charge, you align, because chaos is for the enemy. They look wild, unpredictable, almost free, which is about to become a problem for them. Rome solves problems with timing, not bravery. Fighting is not dramatic, it is close, fast, and deeply personal. This is the part where training replaces thinking completely. You expect something meaningful, but mostly it just feels like work. Victory looks less like glory and more like accounting. Congratulations, you survived, which means you get to do it again. War is not battle. War is walking until your legs forget they belong to you. Every night you build a small city just to prove you are too tired to enjoy it. Rome expands confidently into places it barely understands, which somehow always works out. This is where Rome ends on the map, and problems begin in real life. The enemy does not care about your formation, which is deeply inconvenient. Discipline is what keeps you alive when everything else stops making sense. This is not heroic combat. This is survival with better organization. You do not chase too far, because dying in a forest for Rome feels less impressive up close. Victory is confirmed not by celebration, but by counting who is still breathing. You are far from home, which is exactly where Rome needs you. Eventually, you stop chasing enemies and start waiting for them to starve, which is somehow considered strategy. War becomes construction work with occasional death interruptions. The enemy finally has the advantage, and they use it enthusiastically. You become a moving roof, which is not glamorous but surprisingly effective. Climbing toward people actively trying to kill you is a strange career choice, but here you are. There is no room for tactics here. Only whoever pushes harder lives longer. Once the wall breaks, restraint usually goes with it. Rome calls this victory, the people inside call it the end of everything. You were told you were bringing order, it just happens to arrive on fire. The empire grows, mostly by reducing other places. Time passes differently in the army, mostly because every day feels exactly the same, but worse. Rome does not run out of men, it just replaces them faster than they can think. Congratulations, you are now the problem you once complained about. At some point, you stop remembering who you were before the armor. Home continues without you, which feels unfair but completely logical. Leaving is not an option, it is a lesson for everyone else. Even when nothing happens, something is always about to. You no longer wake up confused, you wake up ready, which is not as comforting as it sounds. Waiting becomes your main skill, which is impressive for something so miserable. You joined to survive and somehow became part of something that does not care if you do. At some point, the enemy stops being tribes and starts looking disturbingly like you. This is no longer survival. This is industry. War scaled up until it feels like administration. They trained, they adapted, and now they die slightly more efficiently. Thousands of men walking toward each other is less dramatic up close and more deeply stupid. Strategy works beautifully until it meets another strategy doing the same thing. This is not combat, this is pressure applied to flesh until something gives. By now, you are not killing people. You are removing obstacles. Discipline wins again, which is comforting until you realize what that says about you. In the end, everyone looks the same once the armor stops mattering. Rome calls this victory, history calls it expansion, you call it another day. After enough battles, victory starts feeling less like success and more like routine maintenance. Rome rewards loyalty generously, as long as you survive long enough to collect. You did everything right, which earns you slightly better problems. War does not end, it just changes direction. Eventually, Rome runs out of enemies outside and starts looking inward. Fighting for Rome is simple until Rome splits into multiple versions of itself. You notice something dangerous, you no longer believe in anything, but you are still very good at this. At this stage, it becomes unclear who the enemy is supposed to be. You stop asking questions because answers do not improve anything. Rome keeps moving, and so do you, mostly out of habit. And here it is, the logical conclusion. Rome finally fighting Rome. The enemy looks familiar because it is. Orders still exist, even when they stop making sense. Discipline turns against itself, which is impressive in a deeply tragic way. Training is universal, which means killing each other becomes very efficient. For a moment, you realize this could have been avoided, which is the least useful realization possible. Then instinct wins because thinking gets you killed faster. Nobody really wins here, but that does not stop anyone from claiming they did. It becomes difficult to tell which side you were supposed to be on. You joined to serve Rome and ended up surviving it. By now, war no longer feels like an event, it feels like weather. Always there, always ruining something. You are still standing, which in the Roman army mostly means you have not yet been selected by bad luck. To them, you look seasoned, which is a flattering word for damaged but functional. Nobody cheers anymore, because enthusiasm is usually the first thing war kills. This is what empire really looks like, not glory, just logistics with a body count attached. And like all large systems, Rome becomes fragile the moment someone hits the part carrying food. Heroism becomes very practical when starvation is one ambush away. Nothing destroys dignity faster than killing a man next to overturned flour sacks. Victory feels less convincing when you are counting bread instead of bodies. Rome keeps advancing, mostly because stopping would make all this suffering look unnecessary. Eventually, the enemy becomes less important than the season, and winter proves far more committed to killing you. The empire can conquer nations, but apparently warm socks remain beyond its strategic imagination. Battle is glamorous compared to disease. At least battle lets you pretend there was a reason. Some men survive years of combat only to be quietly erased by mud, fever, and administrative indifference. You barely recognize yourself now, which is convenient because Rome mostly recognizes service numbers anyway. The machine does not pause for grief, it updates the roster and continues chewing. Even misery gets interrupted here because the frontier believes in multitasking. At this point, instinct does all the work while your soul files a formal complaint and leaves. You held the line, which is Roman for, you get to suffer again tomorrow. The frontier does not make you stronger, it just strips away everything that is not endurance. Then comes the kind of campaign commanders call decisive, which usually means catastrophic on a much larger scale. The speeches are polished and confident, built on the brave assumption that you won't survive to critique them. Once you have heard enough promises, they stop sounding like inspiration and start sounding like inventory management. Everything Rome does best is here: discipline, engineering, timing, and industrial-scale homicide. Battle at this size stops being personal and becomes physics with screaming. There is no glory left now, only motion practiced so many times it outlives belief. Even Roman order has a breaking point, and it looks exactly like panic wearing armor. Not because you still believe in the eagle, but because disorder kills faster than loyalty ever did. So the empire wins again, in the same way a fire wins against a house. They call this a triumph, knowing it's just survival given better propaganda. After the victory comes the accounting, and accounting has never cared who felt brave about it. The empire calls this order, but up close it looks like exhausted men sorting meat. By now, horror does not hit you all at once. It settles in quietly, like rent. At some point, honesty becomes crueler than comfort, so you let silence do the work. This is the genius of empire. It can plan tomorrow before today has finished bleeding. Rome buries memory efficiently, because grief is terrible for momentum. You spent years learning how to use steel, and all it really taught you was repetition with consequences. The line still moves because standing still would force everyone to think. You survived the decisive battle, which is unfortunate because now you have to live after it. Home is still there, which would be comforting if it felt anything like home. You spent years believing your suffering held up the world, and the world responds by continuing normally without applause. Reunions are awkward when everyone expected either a hero or a corpse and got something far less convenient. Peace has its own discipline, and you are embarrassingly bad at it. The war came home inside you, because of course Rome could not leave one last problem behind. Civilian life is much harder than advertised when your brain still expects horns in the dark. After all that service, the empire thanks you with paperwork and a patch of dirt, which is either insulting or perfectly on brand. Nothing is more disturbing than seeing your own mistake marketed to the next generation. Empires do not need truth to recruit, they only need hunger and decent slogans. You made it home, technically, which is not the same thing as coming back. Time softens the body faster than memory, a remarkably rude design flaw. The battles blur together, but the fatigue and the fear stay sharp. To people who never saw it, war always sounds cleaner in retrospect. They hear empire. You remember rot and men screaming through broken teeth. The equipment survives beautifully. The people who filled it, less so. Once, these symbols meant purpose. Now, they mostly mean duration. Rome outlasts the individual until sacrifice starts to look natural. History remembers conquest because history rarely interviews the tired. Were you a conqueror, a victim, or just one more body on someone's map? You gave Rome your life, and Rome turned it into a road. Eventually, you stopped being useful to the empire, which is the closest thing to retirement Rome offers. Your body keeps the record better than any archive, and it does not forget anything politely. They look exactly like you used to, confident, replaceable, and not yet aware of the cost. To them, you are experience. To yourself, you are what happens when experience runs out. Wisdom is mostly ignored when it arrives too late to be useful. Rome does not slow down for reflection, it builds roads over it. The machine keeps moving because it always did. You realize something uncomfortable. Nothing you did was unique, it was simply necessary at the time. And necessity is the most disposable thing in the world. You are no longer part of Rome, just something it used correctly. In the end, there is no dramatic final battle, just a body that finally stops cooperating. The armor outlives the soldier, which feels intentional. No monument is required. Rome has never struggled with forgetting individuals. History rarely pauses for names that were only useful once. Instead of you, they remember the idea, cleaner, stronger, and conveniently silent. The legend is easier to maintain when the people inside it are no longer available to disagree. Reality is inefficient, so Rome edits it. The man disappears first, then the suffering, then the truth. What remains is structure, not story. You are gone, but Rome is still on schedule. Time eventually does what no enemy could. It dismantles the empire piece by piece. And then comes the final transformation, memory turning into myth. In this version, everything is clean, purposeful, almost admirable. The inconvenient parts are removed because they slow down the story. And just like that, the cycle begins again. Admiration without understanding. Individual lives dissolve into a single image called discipline. The empire may fall, but its systems have a habit of surviving in new disguises. Different names, same logic, organize people, move them efficiently, and call it progress. So, what were you really? A man, a soldier, or just a temporary solution that lasted long enough to be remembered incorrectly? You lived an entire life for Rome, and in the end, Rome turned it into a story someone else will misunderstand.